The investor had crossed the ocean for a decisive meeting with the Tycoon. But there was one problem no one dared to admit. He spoke only French. None of the mansion's staff, managers, or assistants understood a single word. The tension built fast. Urgent questions, awkward pauses, helpless glances. The Tycoon, a man who never lost control, was seconds away from snapping. Until a calm voice broke the silence. Fluent, precise, effortless. It was Mariana, the Latina maid who had always slipped quietly through the hallways. The investor lifted his eyes slowly when he heard her. The Tycoon stopped breathing. Mariana spoke French not like someone who had studied it, but like someone who had lived inside it. The investor's expression changed as she translated. Not surprise, recognition, and in that moment, the Tycoon realized this was no longer about business. It was about a past someone had buried too deep. The investor had crossed the ocean for a decisive meeting with the Tycoon. But there was one problem no one dared to admit. He spoke only French. None of the mansion's staff, managers, or assistants understood a single word. The tension built fast. Urgent questions, awkward pauses, helpless glances. The Tycoon, a man who never lost control, was seconds away from snapping, until a calm voice broke the silence. Fluent, precise, effortless. It was Mariana, the Latina maid who had always slipped quietly through the hallways. The investor lifted his eyes slowly when he heard her. The Tycoon stopped breathing. Mariana spoke French not like someone who had studied it, but like someone who had lived inside it. The investor's expression changed as she translated. Not surprise, recognition, and in that moment, the Tycoon realized this was no longer about business. It was about a past someone had buried too deep. Cena. The meeting room had been prepared since dawn. Crystal glasses aligned like soldiers on the long polished table. Linen napkins folded with surgical precision. The scent of fresh citrus polish lingered in the air, sharp and clean. Outside the tall windows, the city shimmered in muted rhythm. Everything was ready for power to enter. Everything except language. And that absence already hovered like an invisible fracture waiting to split the morning. Mariana moved through the room unnoticed the way she always did. Her footsteps were soft on the marble floor, not timid, just trained into silence. She adjusted a chair by instinct, straightened a folder no one had touched yet. The staff around her whispered in low English, tense and fragmented. She understood every word. She was not supposed to. Her uniform marked her as invisible, but her mind was awake and listening. The French investor arrived exactly on schedule. The energy shifted as soon as the door opened. He entered with a subtle arrogance shaped by wealth that didn't need to announce itself. His suit was dark, immaculately tailored. His eyes scanned the room with a calculating calm. He spoke immediately, rapid, fluid French. The words fell into the space like foreign currency no one knew how to spend. Silence followed him like a delayed echo. Managers glanced at one another. Assistants stiffened. Someone cleared their throat too loudly. The man repeated himself, slower now, irritation threading into his voice. Still, no answer came. The silence thickened, no longer neutral. It became humiliating, the kind of silence that exposes incompetence without raising its voice. Mariana stood beside the service door holding a silver tray, watching the tension accumulate like static in the air. She could feel it in her skin, the way storms announce themselves hours before rain. No one looked at her. No one ever did. The room belonged to power and to those who served it in visible roles. She moved through another layer entirely. One of the senior managers attempted broken English, loud and clumsy, hoping volume might bridge meaning. The Frenchman's jaw tightened. His eyes hardened. He replied again in French, sharper now, clipped with disbelief. His tone no longer asked. It accused. Mariana felt the shift in his cadence instantly. He was talking about guarantees, about timelines, about something that should not go unanswered. At the far end of the table, empty space waited for the Tycoon. His seat was set with deliberate symbolism. Thicker leather chair, different glassware, subtle dominance embedded in furniture. Every second of his delay stretched the tension thinner. The Frenchman checked his watch with open irritation. His patience was a currency he never spent without return. Mariana felt something stir in her chest. Not fear. Recognition. The French rolling through the room did not feel foreign to her. It felt intimate, unwelcome in its familiarity. Certain words struck her like echoes. Sequence. Terms. Delay. Each carried weight beyond business. She tightened her grip on the tray without conscious decision. Her breath slowed the way it used to when she was very young and needed to disappear. The investor leaned forward now, hands flat on the table, his voice rising. The manager shifted backward in response like a failing tide. Sweat appeared at one temple. Someone reached instinctively for their phone, then stopped. No one wanted to be the one blamed for making the call that exposed the house as linguistically naked. From the doorway, Mariana watched the room fracture under pressure, and deep inside her, another fracture answered. Because she did not hear his words as strategy, she heard them as memory. The French did not sound learned. It sounded inherited. And that frightened her more than the rising anger on the man's face. The door behind the Tycoon's chair opened without warning. No footsteps yet, just the signal of presence about to happen. The energy in the room snapped into alert alignment. The Frenchman straightened sharply. The managers turned as one. Mariana felt the air shift against her skin, the way gravity changes when something massive enters. The Tycoon had not yet crossed the threshold, but the room already behaved as if he had. Spines straightened, voices collapsed into disciplined quiet. Even the investor paused mid-breath, sensing instinctively that the axis of power had shifted before the man himself was visible. Mariana felt it too, that silent authority rolling in before a storm. Her pulse quickened, not from awe, but from the strange certainty that his arrival would not end the tension. It would only reshape it. The Frenchman turned partially toward the door, then back to the room. Irritation now shaded with calculation. He switched to faster French, addressing the managers with sharper edges. Mariana caught every nuance, not just the demands, but the insult braided beneath them. He was questioning credibility now, the competence of the house, the legitimacy of the empire butting silently against him. Her throat tightened as she realized the conversation had crossed from business into challenge. One of the assistants tried again to respond in English, reaching for rehearsed phrases meant to soothe investors, not confront them. The Frenchman cut him off without looking at him, his hand lifting in a dismissive slice through air. The gesture alone humiliated. Mariana saw the assistant swallow, his authority collapsing in real time. She had seen this before. Men dismantled without being touched. Power did not need hands when language served as its instrument. The service corridor behind Mariana remained dim, a narrow throat behind the glowing chamber of wealth. She stood precisely where the light from the meeting room stopped touching the floor. Half seen, half erased. It had always felt safer there. Today, for reasons she could not yet explain, the shadow felt like betrayal. The French words vibrated in her memory with unsettling intimacy. She could almost hear another voice speaking them, softer, older, closer to her than this room had ever been. The investor exhaled sharply now, his frustration exposed. His next sentence landed heavily, slow and deliberate. Mariana felt it before she consciously understood it. He referenced a previous agreement, not recent, not public, one that predated the current board, one that should not exist on record. A murmur rippled among the managers who grasped only the tension, not the content. Mariana's heart stuttered once. That phrase did not belong to this morning. It belonged to another chapter entirely. The delay stretched into something cruel. The Tycoon still had not entered. The investor's discomfort hardened into offense. He spoke again, slower, his French now heavy with implication. Mariana caught the weight beneath the syllables. Penalties, legacy clauses, consequences that did not belong to ordinary negotiations. The managers shifted uneasily, unable to follow the content, yet fully aware the temperature of the room had crossed into danger. Mariana felt the words collect inside her like uninvited ghosts. Her hands trembled for the first time, not from fear of being seen, but from the shock of recognition. Certain phrases curled through her memory with a familiarity that made her chest ache. She remembered a woman's voice, distant and firm. shaping those same sounds in the dark of something long behind her. The memory had no image attached to it. Only cadence. Only meaning. And now that meaning lived here, exposed in a room that pretended it had no past. The Frenchman's eyes flicked briefly toward the service corridor, not with recognition, but irritation at the static presence near the door. Mariana lowered her gaze automatically, reflex older than thought. Yet her mind did not retreat with her posture. Every word he spoke lit another dim corridor inside her. She suddenly understood that what unsettled her was not the language. It was the fact that the language unsettled him. A door opened down the hall, footsteps this time. Slow, deliberate. Each one landed with intention. The sound carried into the meeting room with quiet authority. Chairs did not move. Backs straightened further. Conversations aborted themselves mid-thought. The atmosphere clicked into a different alignment. Not relief, not resolution, but submission to something heavier. Mariana did not turn yet. She felt him before she saw him. The Tycoon entered without haste. He did not scan the room. He understood it already. His presence did not demand attention. It absorbed it. He took his seat at the head of the table without greeting, without acknowledgement of the disruption unfolding. The Frenchman watched him closely now, curiosity overtaking irritation for the first time. A predator reassessing terrain. The Tycoon's eyes lifted slowly, indifferent, unreadable. The Frenchman spoke again at once, longer this time, measured, controlled. Mariana followed every sentence as if it were written directly into her bloodstream. He was asking not about the present deal now, but about continuity, about succession, about guarantees stitched into the edges of decades. The managers glanced between the two men like spectators at a chessboard whose rules they did not know. The Tycoon listened without expression. Silence followed. Not the empty kind, the loaded kind. The Tycoon's gaze drifted just once toward the service corridor, not to the room as a whole, to one precise location inside it, to Marion's shadow on the floor that had not moved. Their eyes did not meet, but something in the directness of his attention made her breath catch as if recognition had brushed too close to the surface. The Frenchman spoke again, sharper. This time he said a name. It was not the Tycoon's, it was not Mariana's either, but the sound of it struck her so violently that her knees weakened against the tray. The name carried weight, history, accusation, and something intimate, buried beneath formality. The Tycoon's hand stilled on the table, just for a fraction of a second. Enough. Enough for Mariana to understand that what was surfacing in this room had nothing to do with translation anymore. The moment stretched, the name still vibrating in the air, unanswered, alive. And for the first time since the meeting began, Mariana realized the danger was no longer in being invisible. It was in being heard. The name still vibrated in the air like something alive. To everyone else it was only sound, foreign and inaccessible. But to Mariana it felt heavier, rooted somewhere beneath her ribs, her fingers curled tighter beneath the tray, nails pressing skin. She was no longer merely observing the room. The room had reached into her. Time seemed to thin, stretching into a fragile thread between past and present she could no longer ignore. The Tycoon remained still, but the quiet around him changed texture. His stillness was no longer neutral. It carried tension folded tightly inside it. Mariana watched his profile from the shadowed edge of the service corridor and felt the strange awareness that he, too, had felt the rupture, even if he refused to acknowledge its origin. Power shifted not loudly, but through minute alterations others learned too late to read. The Frenchman repeated the name with measured precision, his tone no longer impatient but surgical. He was no longer negotiating. He was testing. Mariana understood this instantly. The syllables were meant to provoke memory, not comprehension. The managers leaned subtly away from the sound as if distance alone could protect them from humiliation they could not translate, but fully sensed unfolding. The Tycoon finally spoke again in controlled English, his voice velvet soft and edged with authority. He framed the delay as inconvenience, not weakness. His tone reassured his staff while concealing irritation beneath formal grace. Mariana felt the lie pass through the room cleanly, almost elegantly. The relief that followed was shallow, fragile. Even those who exhaled knew they were standing on glass. The Frenchman answered without raising his voice. His French became slower, weighted with implication. Mariana followed every curve of meaning instinctively. He was referencing pages that were not public, agreements sealed when no one now present held power. The kind of promises men later pretend were never written. Her breath tightened softly as she realized he was not seeking confirmation. He was asserting historical authority. A senior executive attempted another English explanation, too quick and overly bright. The failure rang immediately. The Frenchman lifted a hand in dismissal without looking at him. The gesture erased the man mid-sentence. Power moved through motion, not volume. Mariana saw shame drain color from his face, even though he did not understand the insult delivered fluently from across the language barrier. The Tycoon leaned back with deliberate calm. He stretched the moment like fabric pulled tight. When he spoke, his words were precise and measured. He reframed the discussion as present-focused, an act of controlled dominance. Mariana recognized the maneuver immediately. Redirect the battlefield when the terrain turns dangerous. But beneath his words, she felt something shifting. Irritation, yes, but also calculation edged with unease. The Frenchman's reply carried the word heritage again. Legacy. The syllables cut softly through the room and struck Mariana with unsettling intimacy. A flicker rose behind her eyes, a dim kitchen lit by a single bulb, paper stacked neatly beside chipped ceramic cups, her hands learning letters that did not belong to her birthplace, but would later shape her survival. The Tycoon's jaw tightened, barely visible but unmistakable. He had understood that word. Mariana saw it clearly now. The tension was no longer confined to misunderstanding. It had shifted into confrontation between two histories colliding beneath polished diplomacy. The managers sensed the danger without grasping its source, their postures tightening like tightened knots under tailored suits. The Frenchman leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed with quiet insistence. He spoke again, this time weaving the name into a challenge framed as curiosity. Was this empire continuation or merely inheritance without memory? Mariana felt the question vibrate inside herself before it reached the Tycoon. The answer carried risk for both of them, and the room could feel that something irreversible had begun. Silence pressed outward. It was no longer empty. It was loaded with stakes no one in the room could safely define. The Tycoon did not speak immediately. His pause stretched enough to make the executives shift nervously. They were accustomed to control arriving quickly from his end of the table. This delay unsettled them more than the foreign language ever had. Mariana's pulse beat steadily, loud in her ears. Her instinct told her to vanish unchanged, to remain part of the room's machinery rather than its pulse. This had always been her safest posture, efficient invisibility. Yet now, standing there with every French word landing cleanly inside her chest, silence felt less like camouflage and more like surrender. The Frenchman let his voice soften slightly, his tone now edged with something strangely personal. Mariana understood that shift too. This was no longer purely business. The cold geometry of negotiation had given way to something shaped by memory. The room could not sense it, but Mariana felt the temperature change within every syllable. The Tycoon's eyes drifted once more toward the service corridor, not casually, searching. It was the second time his attention had moved toward the shadows where she stood. His gaze did not settle on her directly, yet the awareness felt uncomfortably precise. For the first time, Mariana experienced that dangerous sensation of being anticipated rather than seen. An assistant's phone vibrated uselessly with an incoming message that no one dared read. The sound felt obscene in the thickened quiet. The Frenchman spoke again, now openly questioning whether real authority still sat at this table. His words were wrapped in politeness but sharpened with certainty. Mariana could hear that he no longer considered the delay accidental. He considered it symptomatic. The Tycoon's voice returned colder. He asked again, deliberately, whether anyone in the room could understand what the Frenchman was saying. His question was no longer rhetorical. It carried real irritation now, sharpened by the awareness that something fundamental was slipping just beyond his control. No one answered. Their silence exposed the house more brutally than any accusation. The executives avoided one another's eyes. Fear rippled through posture, not speech. They had prepared for legal tension, financial pressure, political angle shooting. They had not prepared for exposure this raw. To not understand was suddenly to be unarmed. Mariana watched men who wielded millions shrink in place because sound had outpaced their reach. The Frenchman inhaled, visibly relaxed now. He had reached the phase of amusement reserved for those who know the upper hand is secured. He spoke one final sentence in French, slow and composed. Mariana understood immediately. He no longer believed anyone here could meet him on equal ground. He had already marked the negotiation as asymmetrical. Something inside Mariana fractured, quietly but completely. It was not fear. It was recognition. To remain silent now would be to assist in the humiliation unfolding. Her invisibility, once protection, had become complicity. She realized with startling clarity that silence was no longer a neutral act. It had chosen sides without asking her consent. Her body moved before her doubt could catch it. The tray left her hands and settled on stone with measured precision. The soft clink echoed unnaturally loud within her own chest. One step carried her into the spill of light from the meeting room. She felt eyes turn slowly, confused at first, then startled by the intrusion of a figure never meant to occupy the center. She spoke calmly in French, her voice low, clear, unadorned. She did not raise it. She did not perform. She simply asserted presence through sound that belonged to her with effortless authority. The sentence was brief, controlled, an offer to translate, phrased not as defiance but as solution. The reaction was instantaneous. The Frenchman turned sharply, eyes locking onto her with something no accusation had produced. Recognition flickered there, not of her identity, but of her fluency as lived, not learned. He watched her as one recognizes an unexpected mirror in unfamiliar territory. The Tycoon froze. Not metaphorically, physically. For the briefest stretch of time, even the subtle movements of his breath ceased. His control did not break. It paused, and in that pause lived something rare. Uncertainty. Slowly, his gaze lifted and found her. Mariana did not lower her eyes. For the first time since entering this house, she stood fully within its light, not as servant, not as silhouette, but as voice. And the room, which had been built for power, shifted to accommodate a presence it had never planned for. The room did not erupt. It didn't gasp or stir in any dramatic rush. It simply recalibrated around her voice. Mariana felt it. The subtle reorientation of attention, the gravity bending in quiet increments. Dozens of eyes moved toward her with confusion etched into their authority. The Frenchman regarded her as one might study a living artifact, something unexpectedly real in a room built on performance and control. The Tycoon did not look away. His expression remained unreadable, but his stillness had transformed. It was no longer passive dominance. It was focus sharpened into watchfulness. Mariana felt exposed beneath his gaze in a way that had nothing to do with her uniform, and everything to do with what she had revealed without meaning to. Language had stripped her invisibility faster than disobedience ever could. The Frenchman spoke directly to her now, no longer addressing the table. His tone shifted, becoming careful, exploratory. Mariana answered without hesitation, translating his words into English with absolute clarity. The sentence cut through the executives like a blade. The investor was confirming that the Tycoon's controlling interest rested on a clause predating the public formation of the company, a clause tied to the name he had spoken. Murmurs rippled instantly through the room. The managers leaned forward, expressions shifting from professional neutrality to alarm. Some reached for their folders instinctively, as though paper might shield them from what they had just learned. Others glanced at the Tycoon, searching for denial in his posture. Mariana kept translating steadily, her voice the only stable bridge between two worlds now colliding openly. The Tycoon's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He did not interrupt her, though every instinct in him demanded control of the conversation. The Frenchman continued, now pressing into territory that had not been navigated in years. He spoke of dormant instruments, of latent authority that had never been officially dissolved. Mariana felt the history inside his words. Not rumor, but archived truth. When she finished the translation, silence slammed into the room with a different violence than before. This wasn't confusion. It was realization. The executives stared at the Tycoon as if the floor beneath them had shifted by several degrees. Mariana sensed that whatever this clause was, it was not theoretical. It existed, and it threatened to reshape the architecture of power they all served. The Tycoon finally moved. He folded his hands deliberately on the table and leaned forward, posture composed, eyes fixed on the Frenchman now instead of Mariana. When he spoke, his tone carried absolute control, not over the situation, but over himself. He challenged the legality of dormant authority, questioned enforceability decades later, framed history as a problem already solved through time. Mariana translated his words with steady precision, but the Frenchman's response arrived faster than defense could settle. He spoke of sealed contingencies buried within restructuring agreements, of dormant rights designed specifically for moments when successors forgot the conditions of their ascent. As Mariana carried the translation across the room, the executive's breathing grew audible with restrained panic. One of the legal advisors finally broke protocol, speaking out of turn. His voice trembled as he cited amendments, corporate overhauls, regulatory resets. The Frenchman listened with polite stillness and then dismissed him with a single sentence. Mariana understood immediately. The amendments had never touched the instrument that mattered. The house had been renovated, but the foundation had remained untouched. The Tycoon did not react outwardly, but Mariana felt the tension ripple beneath his composure. This was no longer a matter of negotiation posture. It was structural. Something beneath the empire's spine had just been illuminated, and it did not belong entirely to him. She sensed that even he had not anticipated this exact angle of attack. The Frenchman shifted his attention back to Mariana, addressing her once more instead of the Tycoon. His next sentence startled her. He asked where she had learned to speak French like that, not as a courtesy, as a recognition. The room stilled again, the question cutting sideways through the negotiation with unsettling intimacy. Mariana translated the legal portions first, delaying the personal question instinctively. The Tycoon noticed immediately. His eyes flicked to her with renewed precision. He had not expected her to manage information flow. The realization that she could choose what arrived and when did not escape him. When the Frenchman repeated his question, this time in English for the room to hear, the moment shifted again. Mariana felt every executive's attention veer toward her. The Tycoon did not speak. He waited. She answered quietly. She said she had learned it as a child, that it had not been taught in a school, that it belonged to her before it belonged to any employer. The simplicity of her answer unsettled the room more than any accusation. The Frenchman's gaze softened minutely. He nodded once, then without warning, he spoke another name. Not the same one as before. A woman's name, spoken with careful gravity. Mariana felt the world tilt slightly inside her chest. She translated automatically before shock could intervene. The name did not belong to her mother, but it belonged close enough to unsettle the blood. The Tycoon's breath caught for the first time openly. A flicker moved across his eyes. Not fear, not anger. Recognition. The executives missed it, too focused on the legal implications unfolding before them. But Mariana saw it. The reaction landed in her body long before her mind processed its meaning. The Frenchman explained that the woman whose name he had spoken had once held controlling authority over the provisional trust that seated the empire, that her stake had never been fully dissolved, that she had vanished before her rights were formally surrendered. As Mariana translated, every word felt like a key turning inside locks long sealed. The Tycoon finally interrupted, demanding documentation. His voice sharpened, cutting through the measured exchange. The Frenchman only smiled faintly and slid a single folder forward across the table. It moved slowly, deliberately, stopping just before the Tycoon's reach. An offering. A threat, folded into paper. No one breathed as the Tycoon opened it. The sound of the folder parting echoed loud in the void. He scanned the first page in silence, then the second. Mariana watched his face shift by degrees, too controlled for panic, but too unsettled for indifference. The truth inside the file was not new to the Frenchman, but it was violently new to the room. The Tycoon closed the folder slowly and rested his palm over it, as though anchoring something that wanted to move. He did not speak at once. The executives waited, fear now naked in posture. Mariana felt the storm coiling behind his composure. This revelation did not threaten his authority. It threatened the narrative of its origin. The Frenchman spoke again, softly now. He said the past does not die simply because powerful men stop mentioning it. Mariana carried the sentence cleanly into English. The words were not loud, but they struck deeper than volume could reach. The Tycoon absorbed them without outward reaction, but something in the room had cracked beyond repair. Finally, the Tycoon turned back to Mariana. His eyes searched her now with unmistakable intent. Not as staff, not as background, as variable. He asked her where she had learned the name the Frenchman had just spoken. The question was framed as casual. It was anything but. Mariana hesitated for the first time. Her silence now was different. It was not protective. It was calculating. The executives leaned forward instinctively. The Frenchman watched with fox-like stillness. The Tycoon waited, studying her in the same way one studies a fault line after the ground shifts. She answered that she had heard the name only once, long ago, that the woman had not stayed long enough to be remembered properly. That memory, she said, had belonged to someone else before it ever brushed against her. The room absorbed her answer with confusion. But the Tycoon did not. Something passed between him and the Frenchman without words, an acknowledgement that Mariana's presence had altered the vector of this confrontation. The negotiation was no longer confined to contracts and shares. It had slipped into provenance, into bloodline, into memory that did not belong cleanly to any one man. The Frenchman leaned back at last, satisfied. He had not won anything yet. But he had shifted the battlefield irreversibly. Mariana felt it in the air, the sensation of architecture being redrawn around her without her consent. Her voice had opened something that power alone could not close again. And as the Tycoon gently steepled his fingers and studied her with a gaze no longer neutral, Mariana realized with quiet clarity that she was no longer simply part of the room. She had become a liability the Empire had not foreseen. The meeting was officially paused, but nothing about the atmosphere suggested rest. Executives drifted into hushed clusters near the windows, voices low, faces tight. Phones appeared in hands that had sworn secrecy minutes earlier. Power recalculated itself through murmurs and coded glances. Mariana remained standing alone near the sideboard, suddenly visible in a way that made the marble beneath her feet feel thinner than it had moments before. The Tycoon exited without announcement. No dramatics, no escort, just the quiet authority of certainty and motion. 2 members of security followed at a precise distance, not guarding him from danger, guarding the building from witnessing his reaction. Mariana felt his absence as tangibly as a pressure drop. The room inhaled once he was gone, the collective breath of people who had survived proximity to something volatile. No one spoke to her at first. They observed her as one might observe an unexploded device, close enough to confirm existence, far enough to avoid consequence. The Frenchman remained seated, composed, fingers resting lightly on the table as though he had never disrupted the equilibrium of the house. His eyes followed Mariana with detached curiosity, not predatory now, but contemplative. A senior legal advisor approached her cautiously, stopping at a distance that betrayed both authority and fear. He asked her, in careful English, where she had learned to translate contracts of that depth. Mariana did not answer immediately. The question itself felt like an attempt to scale her suddenly, to estimate the size of a presence they hadn't seen until now. When she spoke, she kept it simple. She had listened more than she had been asked. The advisor nodded as though that explained everything. It explained nothing. Across the room, 2 executives whispered urgently. Mariana caught fragments. Provincial trust, pre-incorporation architecture, never filed. Each phrase tightened something inside her chest. The Frenchman had not merely introduced a threat. He had exposed an omission so old it had become myth. Something foundational had been assumed, not confirmed, and assumption had built an empire atop itself. A junior assistant approached with a glass of water she had not asked for. His hands trembled slightly as he offered it. When their eyes met, he flushed and looked away. Mariana accepted the glass from habit more than thirst. The water tasted faintly of lemon and metal. She realized she had not moved from that spot since speaking. It felt deliberate, as though the floor itself expected her to remain. 30 feet away, the Frenchman finally stood. The subtle shift drew every gaze in the room toward him. He adjusted his cuff and spoke in French only 2 words. Mariana understood instantly. Intermission. Not for rest. For repositioning. Power never truly paused. It only redistributed. A thin smile touched his mouth as he addressed her gently this time, in French. He thanked her for the clarity. Not for the translation. For the disruption. The way he emphasized the word made it sound less like gratitude and more like recognition between equals. Mariana translated nothing. This exchange did not belong to the room. He asked her where she had learned to listen the way she did. Not the language. The silence between sentences. The cadence beneath intention. Mariana answered honestly. She said she had spent her childhood learning when to speak so that speaking would cost less later. The answer surprised even her. The Frenchman regarded her with renewed interest. Behind the glass, the city continued its indifferent movement. Traffic lines flowed like distant circuitry. No one within the room felt connected to it now. The building had folded inward, becoming its own closed ecosystem of threat and recalculation. Mariana felt as though she were standing at the center of a compass that had just lost north. Her name traveled for the first time along the table as a topic rather than a role. An executive said it carefully, testing whether it now carried consequence. Another asked quietly what department she belonged to. The human resources director, pale and alert, began building a profile from absence. No records, no documentation that matched the sudden relevance. That alone alarmed her more than any accusation. The Frenchman slipped a small card onto the table near her resting glass. He did not explain it. He only nodded toward it briefly, as if acknowledging a move already made. The card bore a Parisian phone number and a single initial. The initial matched the woman's name spoken earlier. Mariana did not touch the card. But she did not look away from it either. A security officer stepped closer, posture polite but firm. He told her the Tycoon wished to see her privately. The choice of words was deliberate, not requested, not invited, wished. Mariana's pulse shifted rhythm. She set the glass down beside the untouched card with a steadiness that surprised her. The walk through the corridor felt longer than its modest length. The marble floor amplified each step. Security flanked her at a respectful distance. No hands touched her, yet she felt guided by architecture designed to resolve resistance before it became visible. The walls were lined with abstract art no one ever stopped to study. Money had purchased their legitimacy. Meaning had been outsourced. She was led not to the Tycoon's primary office, but to a smaller adjacent room she had only cleaned after hours. The room's windows were narrow, the light cooler. The door closed behind her without sound. For the first time since she had spoken in the meeting room, Mariana stood completely alone with the consequences of her voice. The Tycoon entered moments later. No escort this time. No audience. He moved with the same composed authority as before, but the atmosphere shifted instantly. Without the room, without witnesses, his presence felt heavier, less symbolic and more real. He studied her with a degree of directness that felt like interrogation without formal accusation. He asked her how long she had understood what the Frenchman was saying before she chose to speak. The words were quiet. The danger in them was not. Mariana answered carefully. She told him she had understood from the first name. She did not lower her eyes. The Tycoon absorbed this with visible restraint. He asked her why she had waited. She hesitated a fraction longer than before, and then spoke with controlled honesty. She said silence had been her safety, until it became someone else's weapon. The Tycoon considered this without reaction. The angle of his head shifted minutely, power assessing logic rather than obedience. He asked about the woman's name, the second one. Mariana felt the question tighten the room. She answered truthfully. She had heard it only once, from someone who no longer belonged to her life. The Tycoon's lips pressed together briefly, a movement so small it might have gone unseen by anyone less attentive. He crossed to the narrow window and looked at the city without truly seeing it. He said the woman in question had vanished 25 years earlier under circumstances that had never been clarified. That her departure had been resolved only through the absence of opposition. Mariana recognized the language of power rewriting uncertainty into closure. She asked quietly whether the woman had left by choice. The Tycoon did not answer immediately. The pause was answer enough. He turned back to her then, studying her with theory forming behind his eyes. He said that proximity to certain histories carried danger, that not all languages were meant to survive quietly into the next generation. Mariana understood the warning beneath the phrasing. She accepted it without nodding. He offered her a choice framed as opportunity, increased compensation, a private non-disclosure agreement, relocation within the company infrastructure, safety disguised as elevation. Mariana felt how carefully the offer was designed, how efficiently it buried the premise that she could also refuse. She answered that she had not sought opportunity. She had intervened because the truth had arrived without invitation. The Tycoon studied her as one studies an anomaly that cannot be modeled with existing data. For the first time, his focus was not on control, but on unpredictability. He dismissed her with polite authority and instructed security to escort her home for the evening. The phrasing was composed. The implications were not. As Mariana left the room, she understood that her return the following day was not guaranteed as employment, but as leverage. Back in the corridor, the card pressed quietly against her palm for the first time. She had slipped it there without conscious thought. The initial stared up at her as if it had been waiting for years to be seen again. The Frenchman had not simply introduced a legal threat. He had introduced a lineage. As she exited the building under the glow of evening light, Mariana felt the structure behind her shift. Not physically, but narratively. The story of the house had cracked, and she, unwillingly, now stood written into the fissure. Far above her, behind glass and shadow, the Tycoon remained at his window, watching the city move as it always had, unaware that for the first time in decades, something beneath his empire had begun to answer back. And somewhere across the Atlantic, a phone bearing a single initial waited to ring. Mariana did not sleep that night. The city outside her small apartment window drifted through cycles of shadow and neon while her mind circled the same hollow center again and again. The Tycoon's questions replayed with surgical clarity. The woman's name lingered without anchor. Even silence felt occupied now, as though something unseen had moved into her absence and rearranged the furniture of her thoughts without asking. At dawn, her phone vibrated once. A private number. She did not answer. It vibrated again, then stopped. The quiet afterward felt louder than the ringing had. Mariana dressed with careful economy of motion, as if the day itself might fracture if she moved too quickly. Every instinct told her that whatever had been activated in the boardroom would not pause simply because she had left the building. She returned to the mansion under gray morning light. The gates opened without hesitation. That alone unsettled her. No badge was scanned. No name was checked. She walked through corridors that now felt narrower than they had the day before. People looked at her differently, not openly, but with the strained politeness reserved for variables that resist classification. Something had spread overnight. At the executive floor, 2 security officers waited where none usually stood. They nodded, formally neutral. One of them scanned her with an unreadable device before allowing her to pass. The gesture was not hostile. It was administrative. Mariana felt the shift clearly. She had been moved from background to asset without ever agreeing to the transfer. Down the long central corridor, a figure stepped out from between glass offices. The Frenchman. Without suit jacket this time. Without performance. He greeted her in French as if they had scheduled this meeting long ago. His calm unsettled her more than aggression would have. He did not ask about the Tycoon. He asked whether she had slept. She told him the truth. No. They spoke quietly as they walked. He told her the woman whose name had stopped the room was once tasked with safeguarding a provisional trust bound to the Tycoon's original capital. Not parent, not partner. Oversight. He said her disappearance coincided precisely with the moment control migrated into silence rather than documentation. Mariana listened, translating not for power now, but for survival. He did not accuse outright. He traced patterns. Funds that curved before they straightened, signatures that vanished at the border of restructuring decades earlier. He said the woman's name had been erased from visible architecture, but not from sealed instruments. Then he said something that folded coldly into her bloodstream. The contingency tied to the trust could only be unlocked by linguistic confirmation tied to memory, not DNA. Mariana stopped walking. She asked him what language the confirmation required. He answered softly, French. Not legal French, personal French. The sort only someone who had spoken with the woman privately would carry intact. Mariana felt the ground tilt beneath her shoes. The Frenchman watched her carefully now, no longer curious, but methodical. She asked him why he believed she was that confirmation. He told her he did not believe, he suspected. Suspicion, he explained, was what allowed power to move before proof arrived. He had recognized her fluency not as education, but as inheritance. When she asked what inheritance he meant, his answer was precise and contained no sentiment. Access. Across the building, unseen but active, the Tycoon had not remained idle. His internal surveillance teams had already begun stitching Mariana's profile together from negative space. No school abroad, no documented language certification, no family history that cohered with her fluency. Only gaps, clean, strangely disciplined gaps. These unsettled him more than discovery ever could. By midday, Mariana was summoned again, not by name but by clearance. This time she was led beneath the main floors into a restricted archive chamber few employees even knew existed. The air was colder there, the lighting deliberately subdued. The Tycoon waited alone beside a steel table upon which rested a stack of sealed records bound with crimson security tape. He did not waste time. He slid the top file toward her without opening it. The label bore the woman's name and a date nearly 3 decades old. Mariana felt a tremor move through her fingers before she controlled it. He told her these documents had survived 4 corporate overhauls and 3 full erasures because someone had been too afraid to destroy them. He asked her whether she knew what waited inside. She said no, that was not entirely true. She had never seen these pages, but she had heard their echoes long ago, without context. The Tycoon studied her with a patience sharpened by calculation. He asked her whether she understood what stood to be dismantled if that file were to be activated. She answered quietly, everything pretending to be inevitable. The Tycoon watched her for a long moment. Then he told her the woman in question had never been legally declared dead, only disappeared. Her absence had been treated as resignation, not loss. That distinction had allowed power to move forward without legal obstruction. Mariana absorbed the implication with a pressure in her chest that felt dangerously close to grief she was not certain she owned. He asked her where, precisely, she had first heard French spoken with the cadence she now carried. This time his question was not casual, it was surgical. Mariana closed her eyes briefly and answered with the truth she had avoided naming. She said a woman had spoken to her in French every night for 6 months when she was 14. Then the woman vanished. The Tycoon's expression altered in controlled fractions. The date aligned. The timing fractured something behind his restraint. He asked whether the woman had ever given her a name. Mariana nodded. Not the same name spoken by the Frenchman, but its intimate variation. A version meant only for someone who was being trusted with something that could not be retrieved later. The Tycoon turned away from the table. He placed his hands against the cold glass of the archive window, as if steadying something inside himself that did not wish to surface. He said the woman had not disappeared. She had been removed. Not violently, strategically. Because some languages, he said, were too dangerous to remain alive in unregulated circulation. Mariana asked him whether he had ordered it. The question was not accusation. It was precision. He did not answer directly. He said instead that surviving an empire's birth always required silence from those who knew its raw form. Mariana understood that as confirmation without confession. By late afternoon, she was returned to the executive floor, not to her duties, but to waiting. The Frenchman was gone. The card remained warm in her pocket. Messages bloomed silently between departments around her. The building now moved as if anticipating fracture. No one spoke openly, but networks activated in parallel beneath the architecture of calm. Security doubled. Digital access points tightened. Mariana's login credentials unexpectedly expanded instead of restricted. She now saw files she had never been authorized to view before. The Tycoon was no longer choosing only suppression. He was building contingency around her existence. Near evening, her phone vibrated again. This time, no number appeared at all. Only a single initial on the screen. She answered before doubt could intervene. The voice on the other end spoke French as though resuming a sentence interrupted decades earlier. It asked her softly whether she had finally learned how to answer. When silence became costly, Mariana's throat closed. She asked who was speaking. The voice replied with the name the Tycoon had avoided confessing. The woman was alive, not hidden in absence, but positioned in it, watching the empire rot gently around the omission that had never been sealed. The woman told her the trust could not be accessed by signature alone. It required a second confirmation spoken in the dialect they had shared, a phrase Mariana had memorized without knowing why. The phrase, she now understood, was not language. It was a key grown inside memory. Mariana asked what would happen if she spoke it. The woman answered that power always reveals its true shape when confronted by the voice it once tried to erase. Sometimes it adapted. Sometimes it collapsed. There were no guarantees. Only consequence. When the call ended, Mariana stood alone in the quiet corridor, phone still warm in her hand. The empire around her pulsed with systems designed for continuity. Yet beneath it all, a contingency written in a mother tongue waited patiently for articulation. High above, the Tycoon observed the city darken from his office window and understood with rare clarity that the variable he now harbored was no longer merely a linguistic anomaly. It was the unspoken architecture of his origin, learning how to speak back. And somewhere within Mariana's memory, a sentence shaped itself, not as threat, not as promise, but as inevitability, waiting for a moment that no amount of authority could now prevent. Night fell over the mansion in layered gradients of shadow and artificial gold. Mariana moved through corridors that no longer felt neutral. Cameras followed her with subtle precision, their movements too smooth to be accidental. The house had shifted into surveillance mode without announcing it. She sensed it in the way doors responded faster, panels blinked differently, and footsteps behind her no longer attempted to blend into the rhythm of the place. In a sub-level rarely used by staff, two men waited beside a service elevator that did not appear on public schematics. They wore security uniforms but lacked insignia. Their presence was procedural, not protective. One spoke her name without hostility and asked her to follow them. Mariana complied, knowing refusal would already be framed as deviation within systems that anticipated resistance long before it surfaced. The elevator descended deeper than she expected. The air cooled with each passing level, the sound of cables echoing like distant breath inside the shaft. When the doors opened, she stepped into a corridor carved directly from concrete and steel, raw and undecorated. This part of the building had never been designed for visibility. It existed solely for containment, transition, and decisions that did not require witnesses. At the end of the corridor, a different room awaited her. Smaller than the Tycoon's office, but denser in atmosphere. Maps glowed across digital tables. Financial streams moved in real time on silent screens. This was not a place of negotiation. It was a place of orchestration. The Tycoon stood alone at the center, sleeves rolled once, as if preparing for work that did not tolerate ceremony. He did not ask her to sit. He informed her that a foreign intelligence unit had accessed dormant partitions of the trust within the last 24 hours. The access had not been successful, but it had been deliberate. Someone was testing the seals without triggering alarms. The information landed inside Mariana with cold clarity. The situation had moved beyond legal warfare. It had crossed into strategic extraction. He told her the woman had not merely been a custodian of language. She had also been a conduit between financial architecture and transnational leverage networks. Her disappearance had never been intended as permanent erasure, only strategic dormancy. Mariana understood immediately. The woman had not been removed because she was dangerous. She had been removed because she was necessary but uncontrollable. The Tycoon revealed that the phrase Mariana carried was not merely a linguistic confirmation. It was embedded within a layered authentication protocol tied to offshore mechanisms that no public system could reach. The phrase activated a cascade. Not instant access, but irreversible authorization. Once spoken within a verified context, systemic control would shift along routes designed to be invisible until needed. Mariana felt the truth settle into her body with a gravity that pressed behind her eyes. This was no longer about translation, inheritance, or memory. It was about ignition. She asked what would happen if she refused to speak it. The Tycoon answered with practiced restraint. Then others would attempt to extract it from her through alternate means, none of them subtle. He informed her that the Frenchman had not come alone. 2 operatives embedded as logistical consultants had already breached minor infrastructural thresholds, testing movement paths, mapping response times. Mariana realized the negotiation had never been about leverage alone. It had been reconnaissance masked as business. The investor had carried history in one hand and contingency in the other. When she asked whether the woman was truly alive, the Tycoon did not deny it. He clarified instead that survival had never been guaranteed, only maintained. He said the woman's protection was structural, not personal. That meant it could collapse without warning if the architecture around it shifted too fast. Mariana understood the implication with unnerving clarity. For the first time, he allowed himself to ask her what the woman had taught her beyond language. The question was not sentimental. It was forensic. Mariana answered with care. She said the woman had taught her how to recognize when sound was being used as camouflage, how men hid intention inside rhythm, how silence could be cut into shapes just as precise as speech. The Tycoon absorbed this as operational data. He informed her that extraction attempts would not be limited to persuasion. The systems now converging around her did not require consent to proceed. He said this without threat, merely as statement. Power describing its mechanisms without apology. Network restrictions closed around parts of the mansion without visible indication. Emergency protocols at mid-tier levels activated quietly. The house shifted into defensive posture while appearing unchanged from the outside. Mariana felt it as constraint rather than alarm, a tightening of invisible corridors around her movement. She was moved again under escort, this time toward an internal residential wing not listed under staff housing. The rooms there were designed for executive recovery, not for employees. The message was unmistakable. She was no longer classified by labor. She was now being preserved as a resource. Inside the room, she found the walls shielded, the windows opaque to external scanning. Her phone signal dropped and reconnected through a controlled internal network. The air hummed faintly with interception equipment. She sat on the edge of a bed she had not chosen and felt the architecture close around her without restraint. Her phone vibrated once, then twice. This time the number was visible, but foreign. She hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end did not identify itself at first. It spoke the French phrase that only she and the woman had ever spoken aloud together. Proof before explanation. Mariana's body reacted before her mind could. Breath tightening, pulse lifting, certainty anchoring itself inside her. The woman told her time had collapsed. The trust was being pressured from 6 directions simultaneously. Some financial, some political, some extra-legal. The Tycoon's defensive movements had accelerated the convergence. Dormancy had failed. The architecture was now audible to those trained to hear it breathe. Mariana asked why she had been chosen. The woman answered that she had not been chosen. She had been prepared. Language, she said, was only the surface layer. The phrase had been designed to bind not assets, but lineage to authorization. A voice could not activate it unless it carried both cadence and fracture, both memory and displacement. Security protocols shifted again throughout the mansion, responding to external pings of increasing frequency. Mariana felt the pressure of invisible countdown without clocks. The Tycoon contacted her through the internal system, informing her that unauthorized movement had been detected inside 2 non-public stairwells. Testing routes. Again, he ordered that she be prepared for immediate relocation if needed. The wording was precise, not evacuation, not extraction, relocation. A variable being repositioned for maximum survivability within conflict geometry. The woman's voice returned softly through the phone. She said the phrase could not be spoken under coercion. Context mattered. The architecture recognized intention. If spoken under threat, the cascade would not fully open. It would misfire, contaminate the channels it touched. Collapse would not be clean. Mariana asked what outcome the woman wanted. The answer arrived without hesitation. She wanted the architecture exposed, not seized, not redirected, revealed, so the illusion of inevitability could finally fracture. Power survived best in silence. The phrase was designed to weaponize memory. The Tycoon waited. The Frenchman prepared. External systems aligned without regard for consequence. Mariana stood between structures whose collision no longer seemed hypothetical. She felt no heroism, no destiny, only the unbearable clarity of being the hinge on which oppressive machinery might fail. Late into the night, the servers beneath the mansion registered a breach that did not originate from any recognized network. Not digital, not physical, linguistic. Someone, somewhere, had begun speaking fragments of the phrase in imperfect cadence. A forced imitation, a test that caused violent oscillation across sealed partitions. Alarms did not sound. Redundancies caught the disruption before catastrophe, but the message was unmistakable. Time had run out. The woman whispered through the line that the next attempt would not be flawed, that the forces moving now would not accept partial ignition again. Either the architecture would respond fully, or it would fracture under brute pressure. Mariana closed her eyes and felt the phrase rise inside her with terrifying clarity. Not words, muscle memory, breath encoded with meaning beyond translation. The sentence the woman had hidden inside her not as instruction, but as inheritance. Above her, within glass and steel, the Tycoon monitored cascading movements of capital and control, realizing too late that the anomaly he had tried to contain was becoming the only remaining stabilization point. And deep within Mariana's chest, the phrase shifted from memory into readiness, not yet spoken but no longer silent. The mansion did not announce the approaching rupture. It remained elegant, luminous, obedient to the illusion of permanence. Beneath the surface, however, systems trembled in patterns too complex for any single monitor to fully interpret. Mariana stood alone in the sealed residential wing, the air faintly buzzing with electronic surveillance. Her breathing slowed deliberately. Every instinct told her that when the moment arrived, hesitation would cost more than action. Her phone vibrated once, not a call, a signal. 3 short pulses, the sequence the woman had once used when words were unsafe. Mariana closed her eyes and allowed the phrase to rise fully for the first time without restraint. It no longer felt like memory. It felt like architecture embedded inside breath itself, waiting only for permission to exit her lungs with consequence. Across the estate, the Tycoon watched cascading data spill across his screens in quiet acceleration. The oscillations had shifted from exploratory to convergent. Financial streams braided into unfamiliar alignments. Dormant channels opened like pupils dilating in darkness. He issued commands with precise timing, moving defensive structures into formation with the speed of habit. Yet for the first time in decades, command did not restore equilibrium. It merely delayed exposure. The Frenchman had relocated off-site, but his network had not. Remote operatives pushed signatures through intermediary shells with escalating urgency. The system resisted, rejecting malformed frameworks that lacked the living cadence required for full ignition. Each failed attempt destabilized additional layers. What the Tycoon had once believed immutable now wavered under pressure that no contract clause had anticipated. Mariana was escorted from the residential wing into the central archive chamber once more. This time, no pretense of politeness remained. Security formed a silent perimeter, not to threaten her, but to contain unpredictable vectors that now radiated from her presence. The Tycoon waited inside, posture composed, eyes sharpened beyond neutrality. The air between them carried the weight of histories converging without consent. He informed her the next breach would trigger forced seizure protocols embedded in obsolete geopolitical treaties. These protocols did not care about ownership, legality, or survival. They existed only to collapse instability through controlled devastation. He told her plainly that if she spoke the phrase now, she would not redirect power. She would detonate layered contingencies that could fracture institutional continuity across multiple territories. Mariana listened without interruption. When he finished, she asked him what continuity had cost the woman whose voice now lived inside her lungs. The Tycoon did not answer immediately. His silence no longer felt calculated. It felt old. Finally, He said the woman had been rewarded with invisibility rather than consequence. Mariana recognized the euphemism instantly. Survival stripped of agency was not survival. It was sequestration. The woman's voice returned through Mariana's concealed earpiece with sudden urgency. External operators had begun synchronizing cadenced surveillance around the mansion perimeter. If forced activation occurred elsewhere first, the architecture would misalign irreversibly. The phrase, she warned, had to be spoken within the core locus of the original financial lattice, the archive chamber itself. Anywhere else would only scatter fragments into uncontrollable propagation. The Tycoon realized too late what had already aligned. This room was no longer merely a repository. It was the geometric origin point of his empire's deepest circuitry. He moved instinctively toward the exit interface, issuing orders that rippled instantaneously through layered command hierarchies. Security responded in mere seconds, yet external constraints now coiled tighter than his internal infrastructure could unwind. The Frenchman's remote proxies initiated simultaneous digital pressure against dormant sovereign conduits. The cascade reached its threshold state, not collapse, pre-collapse. The architecture vibrated like a structure inhaling sharply before yielding. Mariana felt the phrase press upward within her chest, with irresistible clarity. The cadence had always known this room. Architecture remembered what men tried to forget. The Tycoon turned back to her with rare naked intensity. He asked her what she wanted. The question startled even him. It was the first time he had framed her as an independent agent rather than a variable. Mariana answered without flinching. She said she wanted the silence that had built this world to finally speak in full sentences. The woman's voice softened through the channel. She told Mariana that once the phrase was spoken completely, the architecture would no longer obey legacy logic. Authority would redistribute not vertically but genealogically through unseen linguistic anchors embedded inside dormant instruments. No one would own the collapse. It would belong to structure itself. Security shifted uneasily. They had not been trained for linguistic ignition. Weapons could not anticipate sound. Mariana drew a slow breath. The Tycoon's gaze held hers without blinking. In that suspended instant, power recognized what it had never truly controlled. Origin. She spoke. Not loudly, not defiantly. The phrase left her lungs as breath bound to architecture. The room responded first, not with explosion, not with collapse, but with alignment. Screens erupted into cascading recomputation. Streams of capital decoupled from established command matrices and rerouted along unseen historical channels. The system did not break. It re-remembered itself. Across continents, dormant structures awakened. Trusts once sealed by silence opened along genealogical cadence rather than signature authority. The Frenchman watched from a remote console as control vectors dissolved into recursive transparency. He did not smile. This had never been conquest. It had been restoration of withheld mechanics. The Tycoon staggered once as information overwhelmed predictive frameworks designed for linear dominance. Centuries of strategic logic unraveled into branching consequence. He grasped the steel table for balance, not in physical distress, but in disorientation. The Empire's continuity had not shattered. It had multiplied beyond his singular grasp. Silence filled the chamber again. Not empty now, but saturated with aftermath. Security lowered their weapons without instruction, driven by a collective recognition that the threat no longer manifested in physical trajectories. The danger had passed through them and reconfigured their relevance. Mariana felt no triumph, only vastness. The phrase receded inside her as something fulfilled rather than extinguished. The woman's voice whispered softly that it was done, that the architecture could no longer be collapsed through erasure again. It would now require dismantling through exposure, a far slower death. The Tycoon straightened gradually. His power had not vanished. It had redistributed. He remained a dominator within many layers, but no longer the hidden axis he had believed eternal. He looked at Mariana with something unfamiliar threading his gaze. Not gratitude. Respect. Perhaps recognition deferred by decades. He told her the world would soon erupt in soft chaos framed as regulatory recalibration. Names would change. Boards would dissolve. No one would ever publicly credit a maid with structural alteration of transnational legacy. History, he said, would sanitize her into absence again. Mariana answered quietly that history no longer needed permission to speak. It had learned how. The woman's line went silent, not cut. Completed. Mariana understood that disappearance could now occur by choice rather than orchestration. For the first time, the absence felt sovereign rather than imposed. Morning reached the mansion slowly. News feeds across the globe shifted tone without explanation. Markets rebalanced into configurations not predicted by any current model. Analysts would spend years discovering fault lines they could neither name nor trace to a single cause. Mariana was escorted out at sunrise without ceremony. No cameras, no farewell. The gates opened once more with silent compliance. She walked into daylight not as servant nor insurgent, but as anomaly completed. She did not return to her apartment. She did not answer the numbers that began blooming across her phone in foreign constellations. For the first time in her life, she selected her own silence. Far above, the Tycoon remained at his window long after internal systems stabilized into their altered geometries. He understood now that empires did not die through assault. They died through sentences spoken at the right coordinates. And somewhere between memory and future structure, Mariana moved forward carrying a language no one would ever again succeed in burying.